For 300 years, one family sat on the throne of Egypt. And for 300 years, that same family did something to itself that modern genetics now recognizes as a slow-motion catastrophe. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces. Generation after generation, the bloodline folded back into itself, again and again, until the very thing meant to protect their power may have quietly poisoned it from the inside. And somewhere at the very end of that line stood a woman the world remembers for her beauty, her politics, and her death. What almost nobody talks about is what 3 centuries of that bloodline might have actually done to her family and to her. Ancient DNA science has come an extraordinarily long way in the past decade. What used to require guesswork based on statues, coins, and secondhand Greek and Roman accounts can now, in many cases, be tested directly against the biological record preserved inside human remains. Researchers at institutions like the University of Tübingen in Germany, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and Harvard Medical School have spent years refining techniques that let them extract usable genetic material from bones and mummified tissue that are thousands of years old, even in hot, humid climates like Egypt's, where DNA typically degrades far faster than in colder regions. This isn't fringe science anymore. It's a rapidly maturing field that has already rewritten our understanding of migrations, plagues, and royal lineages across the ancient world. And when that same toolkit gets pointed at one of history's most famous and most mysterious rulers, the results are genuinely unsettling. Cleopatra VII ruled Egypt for roughly 2 decades, from 51 BC until her death in 30 BC as the final active monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was not ethnically Egyptian in the way most people assume. Her family descended from Ptolemy I, a Macedonian-Greek general who served under Alexander the Great and took control of Egypt after Alexander died. For 300 years, his descendants ruled as foreign kings and queens, sitting on top of an ancient civilization that was not originally theirs. And for 300 years, they did everything they could to keep their bloodlines separate, sealed off, and, as they saw it, pure. The method they chose to do that is the part of this story most documentaries skip past quickly, almost embarrassed by it. Beginning with Ptolemy II, who married his own full sister Arsinoe II, the Ptolemaic royal family adopted a practice of systematic sibling marriage that continued, with only a few exceptions, for the rest of the dynasty's existence. Brothers married sisters not occasionally, not as a one-time political maneuver, but as an institutionalized family policy stretching across roughly a dozen generations. The justification was theological as much as political. The Egyptian religious tradition already associated divine siblings marrying each other, most notably the gods Isis and Osiris, and the Ptolemies leaned into that imagery deliberately, presenting their marriages as sacred rather than strange. To understand what this actually does to a family at the genetic level, it helps to think about it the way you'd think about photocopying a document. The first copy of an original page looks nearly perfect. Copy that copy again, and you lose a little clarity. Copy that copy of a copy again, generation after generation, and eventually the errors start compounding on top of each other, faint. Smudges turning into visible distortions nobody intended and nobody can fully undo. Human genomes work in a strikingly similar way. Every person carries 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent, and many harmful genetic variants are recessive, meaning they only cause problems if a person inherits 2 damaged copies instead of 1 healthy copy to cover for it. In a large, genetically diverse population, that healthy backup copy is usually available because unrelated parents are unlikely to carry the exact same rare, damaging variant. But when close relatives repeatedly have children together, generation after generation, the odds of both parents silently carrying the same recessive glitch and passing down 2 broken copies instead of 1 climb dramatically higher with every cycle. Geneticists call the resulting pattern inbreeding depression, and it is not a theory confined to royal families or ancient history. It shows up today in isolated island populations, in certain closed religious communities, and famously in pedigree dog breeding, where generations of controlled inbreeding to preserve specific traits has left many breeds with dramatically elevated rates of heart disease, epilepsy, and shortened lifespans. The pattern is consistent enough across species that biologists treat it almost like a law of population genetics. Concentrate a bloodline tightly enough for long enough, and the hidden flaws inside it stop staying hidden. If a story like this is exactly the kind of history you come here for, now's a great time to hit subscribe, because the documented pattern inside the Ptolemaic family is about to get significantly harder to explain away as coincidence. Here is where the historical record and the genetic science start to line up in a way that should genuinely unsettle you. The Ptolemaic dynasty does not just have an unusual marriage policy buried in the footnotes of ancient historians. It has one of the most violent, erratic, and self-destructive family histories of any ruling dynasty in the ancient Mediterranean world, and the pattern repeats, with disturbing regularity across generation after generation. Ptolemy IV had his own mother murdered shortly after taking the throne, then had his brother killed as well, reportedly to secure his position, before descending into what ancient sources describe as erratic, indulgent, and increasingly unstable behavior for the rest of his reign. Ptolemy VIII, remembered by later historians under the nickname Physcon, murdered his own nephew at a wedding celebration, and, according to multiple ancient accounts, sent the boy's dismembered body to the child's mother, his own sister and former wife, as a birthday gift. Ptolemy XI had his stepmother, who was also his cousin, murdered within weeks of marrying her, and was killed by an enraged mob in Alexandria shortly afterward. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, was so widely mocked for his erratic behavior that Alexandrians nicknamed him Auletes, the flute player, a title dripping with contempt rather than respect. And Cleopatra herself had at least 2 of her own siblings killed during her struggle to secure and hold the throne. None of this proves on its own that recessive genetic disorders were responsible for 3 centuries of dynastic dysfunction. Ancient royal families across many unrelated cultures have produced plenty of murderous, unstable rulers without any documented history of sibling marriage at all, and ambition, palace politics, and simple absolute power without accountability are more than capable of producing cruelty on their own. But population geneticists, studying documented royal inbreeding elsewhere in history, most famously the Spanish Habsburg dynasty centuries later, have found something striking when they finally had skeletal and portrait evidence to examine directly. The Habsburgs, who intermarried at nowhere near the intensity of the Ptolemies, but still concentrated their bloodline significantly through repeated cousin marriages, ended their royal line with King Charles II. Of Spain, a man contemporary accounts describe as suffering from severe intellectual disability, chronic illness, and infertility, all consistent with the kind of accumulated genetic damage inbreeding depression predicts. A 2019 genetic analysis published in the Annals of Human Biology modeled the Habsburg family tree directly and calculated that Charles's coefficient of inbreeding, the mathematical measure of how concentrated his ancestry was, sat almost as high as that of a child born from a sibling pairing, despite dozens of generations technically separating him from any single instance of direct incest. If a family that intermarried far less intensely than the Ptolemies still produced measurable, catastrophic genetic consequences within a few centuries, the far more extreme practice inside the Ptolemaic dynasty raises a question ancient historians simply did not have the tools to ask. This is exactly the question modern paleogeneticists want to answer directly, and it's exactly where the trail runs into a frustrating wall. Cleopatra's own remains have never been found. Despite decades of searching, including underwater archaeology in the harbor of Alexandria, where sections of the ancient royal quarter now sit submerged after earthquakes and rising sea levels reshaped the coastline, no confirmed. Ptolemaic royal tomb from her generation has ever been positively identified. Archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has spent close to 2 decades excavating a temple complex called Taposiris Magna, roughly 30 kilometers from Alexandria, based on her theory that Cleopatra and her lover Mark Antony may have been buried there rather than in the city itself. Her team has uncovered coins bearing Cleopatra's image, a mask believed to resemble Mark Antony, and dozens of mummified remains, but as of now, none of them have been confirmed through DNA testing as belonging to the queen herself. Without a body, there is no genome to sequence, and without a genome, no laboratory on Earth can directly confirm exactly how compressed and dangerous Cleopatra's own personal genetic inheritance actually was. What scientists have been able to do instead is study the wider population Cleopatra ruled over, and even that has produced findings worth sitting with carefully. A landmark study published in Nature Communications in 2017, led by researchers, including Verena Schuenemann at the University of Tübingen, successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from 90 mummified individuals recovered at Abu Sir el-Malek, a site along the Nile continuously used for burials from roughly 1400 BC through the Roman period, a time span that fully covers the entire 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The study found that the general population's genetic makeup remained relatively stable across this enormous stretch of time, showing strong continuity with ancient Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean populations. What it also confirmed, indirectly but importantly, is that the Ptolemaic royal family's marriage practices set them dramatically apart from the ordinary Egyptian population they ruled. While commoners along the Nile were marrying outside their immediate families the way most human societies do, the royal court kept doing the opposite, generation after generation, isolated at the very top of Egyptian society by deliberate policy rather than geography or circumstance. Cleopatra herself adds one more genuinely strange wrinkle to this picture. Historical sources are surprisingly uncertain about the identity of her own mother, and some ancient records hint that at least one of her grandmothers may have come from outside the immediate Ptolemaic bloodline entirely, potentially a concubine or secondary partner brought into the royal household through less formal channels than official sibling marriage. If accurate, this would mean Cleopatra's own personal genetic inheritance may have actually been slightly less concentrated than several of her direct ancestors, an unintentional dilution buried inside official uncertainty rather than deliberate policy. It is one of history's stranger footnotes that the gaps in the historical record, the parts nobody bothered to write down clearly, might have quietly spared her from carrying the full genetic weight 3 centuries of policy were designed to concentrate. And whatever the precise genetic reality hidden somewhere in her unknown grandmothers, Cleopatra made choices no other Ptolemaic ruler before her had bothered to make. She was reportedly the only monarch in her entire dynasty's 300-year history who learned to speak Egyptian fluently, along with several other languages, allowing her to address her subjects directly, instead of ruling entirely through Greek-speaking intermediaries the way every ruler before her had. She participated personally in Egyptian religious ceremonies and deliberately presented herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, weaving herself into Egyptian identity in a way her ancestors, isolated behind palace walls and an unbroken chain of sibling marriages, apparently never attempted. Whether that reflects a woman genuinely different from her predecessors, or simply a woman politically desperate enough to try something new as Rome's shadow grew larger over Egypt, is something historians still debate. It's worth pausing here on something important, because a story this dramatic deserves honesty rather than exaggeration. Population-level genetic studies like the Abusir El-Melek research describe broad trends across an entire society over centuries. They cannot tell us the precise genetic condition of one specific individual who left no recovered remains behind. The connection between Ptolemaic inbreeding and the dynasty's documented instability is a pattern supported by comparative genetics from other historically inbred royal families, not a laboratory-confirmed diagnosis of Cleopatra or her relatives specifically. Correlation across a family tree spanning 3 centuries is not the same as biological proof for any one person inside it, and reputable geneticists are careful to draw that exact line. Ancient historians writing about the Ptolemies also had their own political agendas, particularly Roman writers, with every incentive to portray Cleopatra's family as decadent and unstable to justify Rome's eventual conquest of Egypt, meaning some of the most dramatic accounts of Ptolemaic cruelty may be exaggerated, embellished, or outright invented by writers who never had access to genetic evidence and had every reason to make the family look monstrous. Until a confirmed Ptolemaic royal tomb is discovered and successfully sequenced, something Martinez and other archaeologists continue actively searching for along Egypt's coastline: the precise biological truth behind 3 centuries of dynastic. Dysfunction will remain a documented historical pattern rather than a confirmed genetic verdict. What makes the story linger long after you first hear it is not really the specific violence or the specific marriages, disturbing as they both are on their own. It's the quiet mathematics sitting underneath all of it, the same mathematics geneticists have since confirmed in the Habsburgs, in isolated island populations, and in countless controlled breeding studies across the animal kingdom. A bloodline sealed too tightly against the outside world doesn't stay strong forever. It slowly turns inward on itself, and if you concentrate anything for long enough, generation after generation, whatever was hidden inside it eventually has nowhere left to hide. The Ptolemies believed they were protecting something sacred by keeping their blood pure and unbroken for 300 years. What the genetics of inbreeding suggests, even without Cleopatra's own body to confirm it directly, is that they may have been slowly, silently destroying it instead, one generation at a time, until the very last queen of Egypt inherited not just a crown, but the accumulated weight of 3 centuries her family never fully understood. If this kind of deep historical mystery is exactly what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a lot more hidden history like this waiting to be uncovered. Somewhere along the Egyptian coastline, buried under sand, seawater, or centuries of shifting earth. The answer to exactly how much of that inheritance Cleopatra herself actually carried may still be waiting to be found. Until that day comes, her bloodline remains exactly what it has been for 2,000 years. One of history's most famous names, sitting on top of one of history's most quietly terrifying family trees.